Complex sentences are complex. Hi everybody, my name is Alisha. Welcome to part 3 of the sentence structure series. This series covers the 4 sentence structures of English and will help you improve your writing. You'll learn how to connect your ideas, correctly punctuate your sentences, and write long sentences that your reader will be able to understand. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the 4 sentence structures of English, the complex sentence. Let's get started. First, let's define the expression complex sentence. A complex sentence is a sentence made from one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. I talked about independent and dependent clauses in parts 1 and 2 of this series, but let's refresh our minds a bit in this episode. First, an independent clause, also called a simple sentence, is a clause that has a subject and a verb. It can stand on its own. It doesn't need any more information to express a complete idea. Second, a dependent clause is a clause that has a subject and a verb, but that cannot stand on its own. It needs some more information to express a complete idea. It depends on other information. With this in mind, we can think of a complex sentence as a pretty straightforward concept. It's just putting a complete idea and an incomplete idea together. That doesn't sound too hard, right? Let's take a look at some examples of complex sentences and break them down. I went back to the office after I ate my lunch. He didn't want to go to school because he hadn't done his homework. Although we were already late for the meeting, my boss wanted to stop and get a coffee. Each of these sentences is made from one independent clause and one dependent clause. Let's break these down so we can clearly see the clauses and their relationships. In the first example sentence, I went back to the office after I ate my lunch, the independent clause is I went back to the office. The dependent clause is after I ate my lunch. In the second example sentence, he didn't want to go to school because he hadn't done his homework, the independent clause is he didn't want to go to school. And the dependent clause is because he hadn't done his homework. In the third example sentence, although we were already late for the meeting, my boss wanted to stop and get a coffee, the dependent clause is although we were already late for the meeting. And the independent clause is my boss wanted to stop and get a coffee. In this sentence, the dependent clause comes first, and the independent clause comes second. Again, to make it really easy to identify which clauses are independent and which clauses are dependent, look for clauses that express a complete idea, clauses that don't need any additional information. Those are independent clauses. Clauses that need something else or that feel unfinished are dependent clauses. A dependent clause typically begins with something called a subordinating conjunction. Let's talk about those next so that you can start to use these words as hints to help you identify these types of clauses. So, what's a subordinating conjunction? And how are subordinating conjunctions different from coordinating conjunctions, which we talked about in episode 2 of this series? In episode 2, we talked about coordinating conjunctions and how we use these words to connect independent clauses or simple sentences. I mentioned the acronym FANBOYS. This word uses the first letters of all the coordinating conjunctions in English: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. A subordinating conjunction is also used to connect clauses, but the difference between a subordinating conjunction and a coordinating conjunction is that a subordinating conjunction connects a dependent clause to something else. In these videos, I'm using the expression dependent clause to talk about these types of clauses, but another word for these clauses that need a little bit of extra information is subordinate clause. Subordinate clause and dependent clause refer to the same thing. A subordinating conjunction is typically used at the beginning of a dependent clause, and we use these conjunctions to connect with other ideas. Unlike a coordinating conjunction, though, sometimes these types of conjunctions do not come between the two clauses. Let's break down the earlier example sentences so we can see what's happening. Let's look at the first example sentence. I went back to the office is our independent clause. It can stand alone. It needs no additional information. After I ate my lunch is our dependent clause. It needs something else to finish the idea. Let's focus on the beginning of this clause. The word that starts this clause is after. This is an example of a subordinating conjunction. It connects the two ideas and shows the relationship between them. Let's go to the second example sentence. He didn't want to go to school is our independent clause. Because he hadn't done his homework is our dependent clause. Again, let's look at the first word in the dependent clause. In this case, it's because. Because is another example of a subordinating conjunction. It connects our clauses and shows the relationship between the ideas. Finally, let's look at the last example sentence. Remember, this one swaps the order of the independent clauses and the dependent clauses. Our dependent clause comes first. It's, although we were already late for the meeting. Our independent clause is second. My boss wanted to stop and get a coffee. The order of the two clauses has been switched, yes, but the subordinating conjunction rule still applies. The word at the beginning of the dependent clause is although, another example of a subordinating conjunction. Okay, this all seems clear enough, right? What would probably be most helpful is a list of subordinating conjunctions, yes? Unfortunately, there are a lot more subordinating conjunctions than coordinating conjunctions. There's no quick and easy acronym to remember a bunch of subordinating conjunctions at once, like there is with coordinating conjunctions. And it's hard to suggest you start with common coordinating conjunctions because a lot of them are very common. Some examples are before, after, because, although, even. There are more than 50 subordinating conjunctions. With these words in your mind as your hint or flag words, spotting dependent clauses will get easier. To practice your identification skills, take a look at a couple of paragraphs in a book or newspaper. Check for these hint words and see if you can use them to help you find the dependent and independent clauses in the text. Okay, so we've learned the basics about how complex sentences are made. Complex sentences are a dependent clause and an independent clause together. But so far, we've talked about just one of the 3 types of dependent clauses. All of our example sentences so far have focused on one type of dependent clause, the adverb clause. An adverb clause gives us extra information about a verb, an adjective, or an adverb. We focused the first part of this video on adverb clauses that modify verbs because these are extremely common sentence patterns. These are also the types of adverb clauses that have the greatest number of subordinating conjunctions. Next, let's take a quick look at some complex sentences with adverb clauses that modify adjectives. We're so happy that you could join us for dinner. She was really worried that her outdoor plants might be damaged in the storm. Last night's dinner was more expensive than I thought it would be. In these sentences, that or than comes after the adjective. In the first 2 example sentences, we see the base adjectives happy and worried. In the third example sentence, we have a comparative adjective, more expensive. When using the base adjective in patterns like these, we use that. And when we use the comparative adjective, we use than. Okay, finally, let's see some examples of adverb clauses that modify adverbs. This type follows the same pattern as the last example in the previous group of sentences. We use the same grammar pattern, and our hint word is than. I took the turn quicker than I should have. The movie ended more abruptly than I expected it would. He spoke to me more honestly than he has in the past. Just as we saw in the previous group, we see adverbs followed by than in these example sentences. This is a quick introduction to adverb clauses, but it's important to be aware of them because these are all ways to create complex sentences. Let's move on to the second type of dependent clause, because the way this type of clause is used to create complex sentences can be quite different from the sentence structures we've seen in this video so far. Okay, the second type of dependent clause is called a relative clause. A relative clause begins with a relative pronoun. I mentioned near the beginning of this video that dependent clauses usually begin with a subordinating conjunction. Relative clauses are an exception to this. They begin with relative pronouns. Thankfully, there are just a few that are commonly used. The most common relative pronouns used to start these clauses are who, which, and that. We might also see words like when, where, and whom starting these clauses. Here are a couple of examples of complex sentences with relative clauses. My mother, who is a baker, owns her own store. Our teacher rolled his eyes at my classmate, who had answered his question with a dumb joke. The iPhone, which is a popular product, gets more and more advanced each year. Here, the relative clauses are in italics, and the relative pronouns are in bold. In the first and third example sentences, the relative clause is in the middle of the sentence. Until now, we've seen our dependent clauses and independent clauses one after another, right? The second example sentence in this group looks like that. But with relative clauses, sometimes the clause gets dropped into the middle of the sentence. These sentences are still considered complex sentences, though. They still consist of a dependent clause and an independent clause. A great way to test to make sure both elements are there is to remove the part inside the commas and see if you have a complete sentence. For example, if we remove "who is a baker" from the first sentence, we get "my mother owns her own store," which is a complete sentence. In the third example, if we remove "which is a popular product," we get "the iPhone gets more and more advanced each year." If you get a grammatically correct complete sentence when you do this test, it means the clause in the middle is the dependent clause. This is a quick and easy way to check and make sure you've got an independent clause around your relative clause. I'm not going to talk in depth about relative clauses in this video, but if you'd like some more information about this, you can find another video about this topic on my channel. Finally, let's move on to the last part of this video, the third type of dependent clause. The last type of dependent clause is a noun clause. Noun clauses are not as common as relative clauses and adverb clauses. Noun clauses can be a little bit tricky because they can be used as different parts of speech. They can act as the subject, as the object of a verb, the object of a preposition, and so on. A simple way to think about them, however, is that a noun clause is simply a dependent clause acting as a noun phrase. Let's take a look at a few examples. Everybody knows that the sky is blue. We heard about what they were saying to the clients. Where they have their meetings is a secret. Okay, let's break down these sentences because these complex sentences present a little bit differently than the sentences we've looked at so far. In the first sentence, the noun clause, our dependent clause, is that the sky is blue. This clause starts with one of the key hint words for this type of clause, that. In the second sentence, the dependent clause is what they were saying to the clients, and the hint word is what. In the third sentence, the dependent clause is where they have their meetings, and the hint word is where. You might look at these sentences and think, okay, I can understand that these words are the hint words that show the start of the dependent clauses, but the other parts of the sentences don't seem to be independent clauses. They need more information to complete the idea. For example, in the second sentence, we heard about isn't an independent clause. There's no object for the preposition. And in the third sentence, is a secret isn't an independent clause either. There's no subject. This is due to the nature of noun clauses. As mentioned earlier, a noun clause is a group of words acting as a noun phrase. A noun clause takes the place of that part of speech. So in the first example sentence, the dependent clause is the object of the verb knows. In the second example, the dependent clause is the object of the preposition about. And in the third example sentence, the dependent clause is the subject of the sentence. Noun clauses are kind of like dependent clauses that are infiltrating independent clauses. We don't drop them in the middle of a sentence like with some relative clauses. Rather, they are used as a specific part of speech. A great tip I found in a reference book that can help you to identify noun clauses is to try replacing the thing you think is a noun clause with the word it and see if it's grammatical. This will tell you if you have a noun clause. Let's try it with these three examples. Everybody knows it. We heard about it. It is a secret. Sounds good, right? This is a super quick and handy trick you can use to test yourself when writing or to check other sentences when you're reading. As with the other types of dependent clause we've looked at, noun clauses have some key hint words that begin the clause. We saw that in the example sentences. We also see words like if and whether. Also very common are words that begin with WH, like where, what, and when. Try looking for these words in text to get a feel for them. Okay, that was a lot of information. It's not so important to know the names of all these different grammatical structures so much as it is important to understand that dependent and independent clauses can fit together in different ways, and we can easily identify our clauses by knowing a few hint words. These pieces of information can help us to construct sentences better and understand how we can put our information together to flow in just the right way. Let's do a quick recap of what we covered in this lesson. First, we learned that a complex sentence is a sentence made from one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Second, a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction is a word that marks a subordinate or dependent clause. Third, we learned that there are three types of dependent clauses: adverb clauses, relative clauses, and noun clauses. These clauses can be used in a variety of ways and begin with different subordinating conjunctions. Awesome! That's everything for part 3 of the sentence structure series. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you want to leave a question or a comment, or if you want to practice writing some complex sentences, feel free to do so in the comment section. Of course, if this video helped you, you can help me by hitting the like button and sharing this video with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more writing, punctuation, spelling tips, and more. I'll see you next time. Bye! The dependent clause is, although we were already sometimes I can't read words, but I can write them pretty good.